The first time my husband called me his housekeeper, I was standing beside him in the dining room of the home I had spent 27 years helping build. There were 12 people at the table. 12 people who knew Daniel Morgan as a brilliant businessman. 12 people who had watched him turn a struggling construction company into a multi-million-dollar empire. And not one of them knew that the woman standing beside him had once owned a piece of that empire. Not one of them knew that I had put my savings into the company when it was drowning. Not one of them knew that I had abandoned a promising legal career because Daniel had begged me to give him 3 years. And certainly none of them knew that the man smiling beside me had spent years making sure I would eventually have nothing to show for those sacrifices. The evening had started beautifully. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing for the dinner. The flowers were arranged exactly the way Daniel liked them. The wine was chilled. The menu had been planned around the dietary restrictions of his guests. I had even gone through his presentation with him that morning, correcting 2 figures, and reminding him that one of his investors had recently changed companies. He had kissed my forehead before leaving for the office. "Couldn't do this without you, Claire." I smiled. "You've said that before. And I mean it every time." I believed him. That was the last time I would believe him without questioning what he meant. By 8 o'clock, everyone had arrived. There was Richard Hale, one of Daniel's oldest investors. Evelyn Price, a senior executive who had worked with Daniel for years. 2 attorneys from his company. 3 potential investors. A financial consultant. And several couples we had known socially for years. I moved around the room, making sure everyone had what they needed. At one point, Richard stopped me. "Claire, you look lovely." "Thank you." He smiled at Daniel. "You're a lucky man." Daniel lifted his glass. I know. For a moment, I felt that familiar warmth. 27 years of marriage. 2 children. A beautiful home. A successful husband. I thought I had something worth being proud of. Then dinner ended. The plates were cleared. Coffee was served. And Richard looked across the table at me. "I don't think we've been properly introduced." He laughed. "Daniel, you've been talking about your family all evening. Who is this?" I looked at my husband. I expected him to say my name. I expected him to smile and say, "My wife." Instead, Daniel barely glanced at me. "Oh, Claire?" He took a sip of his wine. "She helps around the house." The room went quiet. Not completely. Someone coughed. A fork touched a plate. But the conversation stopped. I stared at him, waiting. Surely he would correct himself. Maybe he was joking. Maybe he was trying to make some stupid joke about how much work I did around the house. But Daniel simply smiled. Richard looked uncomfortable. "Oh." Then he nodded. "Well, thank you for everything tonight." I forced a smile. "You're welcome." I don't remember what anyone said after that. I remember walking into the kitchen. I remember placing a coffee cup on the counter. I remember staring at my wedding ring. And I remember thinking, 27 years. That was all I could think. 27 years of marriage. And my husband couldn't even say I was his wife. I went upstairs before anyone noticed my hands were shaking. I stood in front of our bedroom mirror. 55 years old. Gray beginning to show at my temples. A few lines around my eyes. The same eyes Daniel used to tell me were beautiful. I touched my reflection. Then I heard the bedroom door open. Daniel walked in. He removed his jacket and tossed it over a chair. "You disappeared." I turned around. "You called me your housekeeper." He froze. Then sighed. "Oh, Claire." "No." He looked at me. "It was a joke. It wasn't funny. You know what I meant." "Do I?" He loosened his tie. "Those people don't need to know our entire personal life." "Our marriage is our personal life?" "You're twisting my words." I stared at him. For 27 years, I had learned how to read his moods. I knew when to push. I knew when to stop. I knew when he needed silence. But that night, something inside me had changed. I asked quietly, "Do you really think I contributed nothing to your life?" Daniel looked at me. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then he gave the answer that would haunt him later. "You chose to stay home, Claire." I felt something inside me go completely still. I chose to stay home? Yes. You asked me to. I never forced you. No. I shook my head. You didn't force me. I walked toward him. You made me a promise. He looked away. What promise? I almost laughed. You don't remember? He didn't answer. I nodded slowly. That's okay. I walked past him. Because I remember. I left the bedroom. Daniel called after me. Where are you going? I didn't answer. I walked down the hallway toward his office. He had always kept the door closed. There were certain things in there he considered private. Business documents, financial records, old contracts, things I had never had a reason to examine. But that night, I had a reason. I stood outside the door. My hand rested on the handle. Then I heard Daniel behind me. Claire. I turned. He was standing at the end of the hallway. His expression had changed. For the first time that night, he looked afraid. Don't go in there. I stared at him, and suddenly, I knew. Whatever was behind that door, he was more afraid of me finding it than he was of losing me. I opened the door and walked inside. The office was dark except for the light from the hallway. I switched on the lamp. Daniel remained outside. Claire, what are you looking for? I turned toward him. I don't know yet. His jaw tightened. That isn't your business. I almost smiled. Your business paid for this house. He said nothing. And apparently, according to you, I only help around it. I closed the door behind me. Daniel stayed outside. That was the first thing that frightened me. Not his anger. Not his silence. The fact that he didn't follow me. He simply stood there, watching. Waiting. As if he already knew exactly what I was about to find. I walked to his desk. Everything was arranged perfectly. Daniel had always been obsessive about his office. His files were organized by year. His contracts were labeled. His financial statements were kept in locked drawers. I opened the first unlocked drawer. Nothing. The second. Nothing. The third contained old company brochures. I pulled them out. And something fell behind them. A small envelope. My name was written across it. Claire. I stared at it. Daniel had forgotten to lock it away. I opened it. Inside was a letter. The paper was yellowed with age. I recognized the logo immediately. My old law firm. My heart started beating faster. I read the first line. Dear Ms. Morgan, we remain very disappointed that you have decided not to accept the partnership track position. I stopped. I had never received this letter. I read the rest. The firm had been willing to hold my position for another year. They had even offered flexible hours after my son's birth. I sat down. For 27 years, I had believed my career had simply disappeared because I had chosen my family. But this letter said something different. Someone had made sure I never knew I still had a way back. I looked toward the door. Daniel was gone. I kept searching. Behind another stack of documents, I found a folder labeled Morgan Construction, 1999. I opened it. The first page was an ownership agreement. I read the names. Then I saw mine. Claire Morgan, 38%. I stopped breathing. I read it again. 38%. I had owned 38% of the company Daniel had spent 27 years telling everyone he had built alone. My hands began shaking. There were bank statements attached. My savings. Every transfer. Every payment. I remembered them. When Daniel's company nearly collapsed in its first year, I had emptied my savings account. I had told him, "We'll rebuild it." He had cried. He had held me. He had promised, "I'll never forget what you did for me." Apparently, he had. Or perhaps he remembered very well. Because the next document was dated 8 years later. My 38% ownership had disappeared. In its place was a transfer agreement. My signature was at the bottom. I stared at it. It looked like mine, but I had never seen the document. Then, I noticed something. The witness signature belonged to Daniel's former accountant, a man who had died 6 years earlier. I took out my phone. I photographed every page. Then I saw a note attached to the document. It was an email. From Daniel to his attorney. The date was 8 years after we started the company. The message contained one sentence. Claire doesn't need to understand the restructuring. She trusts me. I covered my mouth. The room seemed to tilt. I kept reading. The attorney had replied. And if she asks about her ownership? Daniel's answer was, tell her it's for tax purposes. She'll believe me. I closed my eyes. He had known exactly what he was doing. I wasn't simply forgotten. I had been removed. Quietly. Deliberately. And then I found the document that hurt more than all the others. A draft divorce agreement. My name was at the top. I read it once. Then again. Daniel had been planning to divorce me. 3 months before the dinner. The proposed settlement was insulting. The house would remain his. The company would remain his. Most of the investments would remain his. And beside my name was a description of my contribution. Primarily homemaker, no material contribution to husband's business. I laughed. A quiet, broken laugh. Because I suddenly understood why he had called me his housekeeper. It wasn't a joke. It was a preview. He was preparing the world to see me as someone who had no claim to anything. I heard the office door open. Daniel stood there. He looked at the documents on the desk, then at me. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, you weren't supposed to find those. I looked at him. No. He didn't deny anything. That frightened me more than if he had screamed. I stood. How long? He looked away. How long have you been planning to erase me? Claire. How long? He exhaled. Years. The word landed between us. Years. Not months. Not recently. Years. I picked up the ownership agreement. I owned 38%. Yes. You took it. I didn't take it. You transferred it without telling me. You signed the document. I did not knowingly sign away my company. He didn't answer. I stepped closer. You promised me. I know. You promised me 3 years. I know. You told me I could return to my career. I know. You told me everything we built belonged to both of us. His eyes filled with tears. I know. Then why did you do this? He finally looked at me, and what he said made everything worse. Because I was afraid you'd leave. I stared at him. You destroyed my independence because you were afraid I'd leave you? You were becoming more successful than me. I gave you my career. I know. I gave you my savings. I know. I raised your children. I know. I spent 27 years supporting you. His voice cracked. I know. Then why wasn't that enough? He couldn't answer. I walked out. But I wasn't finished. I called a lawyer the next morning. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She had no connection to Daniel. I placed every document I had found in front of her. She spent almost 2 hours reading. Then she looked at me. Claire, I need to ask you something. What? Did you know you owned 38% of this company? No. Did you knowingly sign the transfer? No. Did you receive any payment for the transfer? No. Margaret leaned back. Then we need to investigate everything. And we did. What she found was worse. Daniel hadn't just transferred my shares. He had slowly separated our finances. He had created trusts, moved assets, changed beneficiaries, and prepared a divorce strategy designed to make me look financially dependent. But there was something else. A name appeared repeatedly. Evelyn Price. I knew her. She had been at the dinner. She was one of Daniel's senior executives. Margaret contacted her. Evelyn agreed to meet us. When she sat across from me, she looked ashamed. I should have told you years ago. Told me what? I knew about the restructuring. My heart sank. How? I discovered it during an audit. Why didn't you tell me? Daniel said you had agreed to it. I stared at her. And you believed him? At first. She opened her bag. I don't anymore. She handed me a folder. Inside were copies of internal emails. One of them was from Daniel. It said, Claire's role should remain informal. The less she appears connected to the company, the easier the next transaction will be. I looked up. What next transaction? Evelyn swallowed. He was preparing to sell a major portion of the company. When? Within months. Suddenly, the dinner made perfect sense. Daniel had not humiliated me randomly. He needed his investors to believe I was irrelevant. Because if they discovered I had a legitimate ownership claim, the transaction could collapse. Then Evelyn handed me another document. I read the title. Divorce Asset Strategy. I looked at her. He planned to divorce me before the sale. Yes. I felt sick. Then I noticed another name in the document. Our son, Michael. Beside his name was a handwritten note. Ensure he understands Claire chose not to build a career and contributed little financially. I couldn't breathe. He had been preparing our son too. That evening, I called Michael. Mom, do you think I chose not to work? There was silence. Dad told me you wanted to stay home. I closed my eyes. Did he ever tell you I was offered a partnership? No. Did he tell you I invested my savings into his company? No. Did he tell you I owned 38%? What? I heard his breathing change. Mom, what are you talking about? I think your father has been lying to both of us. Michael came to my house the next morning. He looked exhausted. He sat across from me while I showed him the documents. He read them silently. When he reached the email about him, his hands started shaking. He told me you weren't ambitious. I swallowed. I was. He said you were happy being a homemaker. I thought I was. Michael looked at me. Mom. His voice broke. You gave up everything for us. I nodded. But I never wanted you to feel like you had to. I reached across the table. I don't blame you. He started crying. Then he said something I will never forget. I've been proud of Dad my entire life. He wiped his face. But now I don't know who he is. Neither did I. Then came the biggest surprise. Margaret called me 3 days later. Claire, we found something. What? The original transfer document. I already have it. No. She paused. We found the original. My stomach tightened. What is different? The signature. What about it? It isn't yours. I froze. But it looks exactly like mine. It's a traced signature. I felt the blood leave my face. Someone had copied my signature. And suddenly, the story became even darker. Daniel hadn't manipulated me into signing away my company. He had forged my signature. We traced the document back to the attorney who had prepared it. That attorney was dead. But his former assistant was alive. Her name was Susan. We found her in Arizona. She remembered the file, and she remembered Daniel. But she also remembered something else. Daniel didn't come alone, she said. Who was with him? She hesitated, then gave me a name. Marianne Morgan, Daniel's mother. My mother-in-law. The woman I had cared for during the final years of her life. The woman I had cooked for. The woman I had driven to medical appointments. The woman who had once held my hand and told me, "You're the daughter I never had." I stared at Susan. She knew? Susan nodded. She was the one who told us Claire would never challenge the transfer. My heart broke in a way I hadn't expected. Because Daniel's betrayal was one thing, but Marianne's betrayal reached backward through 20 years of memories. I remembered sitting beside her hospital bed, feeding her soup, brushing her hair, holding her hand, and all that time, she had known her son was stealing from me. Then Susan gave me one final document. A letter, written by Marianne. It was addressed to Daniel. The first line said, "A woman who has nothing of her own cannot leave a man who provides everything." I couldn't read any further. I put the letter down. For the first time since this began, I cried. Not because of the money, not because of the company, because I had spent years loving people who had been quietly planning how to make me powerless. I took the evidence to Margaret. She looked at me. "We can fight this." I nodded. "I know. What do you want?" I looked down at the documents. "I want my life back." The opportunity came 3 weeks later. Daniel's biggest corporate announcement. Hundreds of people were there. Investors, employees, journalists, business partners. the people whose opinions mattered most to him. Daniel walked onto the stage. He spoke about sacrifice, about believing in yourself, about building something from nothing. I stood at the back of the room, listening to him tell the story of my life without mentioning me. Then he said, "When I started this company, I had nothing." I almost smiled. He had had me. My money. My career. My labor. My trust. But apparently, none of that counted. He finished his speech. The audience applauded. Then I walked forward. The room became quiet. Daniel saw me. His face changed. "Claire." I stepped onto the stage. I placed a folder on the podium. "You forgot someone," he whispered. "Please don't." I opened the folder. The original ownership agreement. People began murmuring. 38%. Daniel stepped toward me. "We can talk about this privately." I looked at him. I talked privately for 27 years. Then I placed the forged transfer document on the podium. "This is how you took it." His attorney stood abruptly. "Daniel, don't say anything." I looked at the audience. "This is how my husband removed me from the company I helped build." Then I placed the old letter from my law firm beside it. "And this is how he made sure I never returned to my career." The room was silent. Then Evelyn stood. "I can verify those records." The original investor, Richard Hale, looked at Daniel. "Is this true?" Daniel said nothing. Richard's face hardened. "You told us Claire had no involvement." Daniel finally spoke. "She was my wife." I looked at him. "Exactly." Then Michael stood. He walked onto the stage. He looked at his father. "Why did you make me believe she wasn't part of this?" Daniel's face collapsed. "I was protecting the family." Michael shook his head. "No." He looked at me. "You were protecting yourself." Daniel had no answer. The investigation lasted months. The forged document was challenged. The ownership transfer was overturned. The divorce strategy collapsed. And the company transaction Daniel had been preparing was halted. Daniel lost control of the company. But I didn't take it. I sold my restored stake. And with the money, I did something Daniel never expected. I built something of my own. A legal foundation for women who had sacrificed careers and financial independence for their families. Then, at 55, I returned to law. My first office was small. Nothing like Daniel's headquarters. No marble floors. No expensive art. No giant conference room. Just a desk. A chair. A window. And my name on the door. Claire Morgan. The first morning I walked in, I stood there for a long time. I touched the letters. Then I smiled. Because 27 years earlier, I had thought my career was over. It wasn't. It had simply been waiting. Months later, my son came to visit. He carried an old photograph. It was from the beginning. Daniel's company. Our tiny kitchen. Our children. Me. He turned it over. On the back, I had written, "The beginning of everything." Michael had added another sentence underneath. "No, Mom. The beginning of everything was you." I cried. He hugged me. And for the first time, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel humiliated. I didn't even feel betrayed. I felt free. Because I finally understood something. Daniel had spent years convincing me that my sacrifice made me weak. It didn't. It proved that I could love deeply. But loving someone does not mean surrendering your identity. Supporting someone does not mean disappearing. And sacrificing for your family should never require you to become a stranger to yourself. Daniel once introduced me as his housekeeper. He wanted those 12 people to believe I was simply the woman who cleaned his home. But they eventually learned the truth. I wasn't the woman behind his success. I was part of the reason he had one. And when he tried to erase me from the story, he made one mistake. He forgot that I had been keeping records of my own life. My name is Claire Morgan. I gave my husband 27 years. I gave him my career. I gave him my savings. I gave him my trust. But in the end, the one thing he could never take from me was the one thing I had forgotten I still possessed. Myself.